Plimoth Patuxet Museums is at the start of the third year of the 3 years of support from the Lilly Endowment related to a project called The Light Here Kindled. And it's a major research and program development initiative around the history of religion in Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag homeland. When Lilly was reviewing our application, we got a call from them and said, "We'd like to talk to you as we consider your approach to us, and we're very intrigued by your referring to Martin Buber as influencing what you would like to do at the museum in the future. Can you explain that?" So before we proceed, let me tell you all about who Martin Buber was. Martin Buber was born in Vienna in 1878 and died in Jerusalem in 1965. He's one of those diverse souls that the way you describe him depends on who you are, how you're looking at him, and from what point in time. He has been called a philosopher. He has been called a translator because of his work translating the Hebrew Bible into German with the goal of creating a German translation that captured qualities of the Hebrew language. He's also been called a theologian, predominantly in English-speaking countries, and we'll explore that idea in a moment. What we did not know when we approached Lilly and we mentioned Martin Buber was that we were in advance of certain key thinkers who were about to publicly mention the need for greater understanding of Buber. One being David Brooks, the New York Times op-ed writer and PBS NewsHour commentator. In his recent book, The Second Mountain, he talks about the importance of understanding Buber because of his emphasis on living in relation. Also, Nancy Kane from the Harvard Business School, she wrote a marvelous book called Forged in Crisis about leaders who had their lives changed by crisis and became deeper, rounder, healthier spirits for confronting those very challenges. And I'd like for you to hear what she said during a webinar that she offered at the height of the pandemic for the Harvard community about how to lead themselves in crisis.
I'm a member of Memorial Church. I've been a member of Memorial Church for a long, long time. We had a minister here when I first joined the church in 2003 named Peter Gomes. Some of you on this webinar will know him or know of him. And he said something really interesting after September 11th. I wasn't in the congregation then, but I read this sermon that he wrote. Let me read it to you. And this is the first thing I want to offer you as a kind of three-part benediction, if you will, or closing takeaways. He said, when in the midst of turmoil and calamity, you seek the inner strength, right? Outer turmoil, inner strength. You seek the inner strength that helps you not only to endure, but to overcome. Do not look for what you can get. Look rather for what you have been given and what you can give, right? So do not look necessarily for what we can get or what we need or what we want. Let's look for what we can give, because here's the thing I've learned through all these different leaders that I've studied. I'm a biographer. I study the inside of people who make good, worthy, decent impact. And what I have learned is all those people ultimately cross the bridge, which is a bridge from one form of power to a much more enduring form of power, from I and my agenda to how I can serve and give to a larger collective, to we, from I to we, from I to thou, as the German theologian Martin Buber once said. So let me just say first, think about what we owe to the people more vulnerable than we. That's a very empowering direction for our thoughts and our actions. And we all have room to act on that to some extent, even confined to quarters. So that's the first thing. Second thing, self-discipline. This is Rachel Carson said at the end of her book, when she was interviewed on a very popular news show, she said, we do not master nature, We master ourselves. Edmund Hillary, the famous mountaineer, said, we do not master the mountain, right? We master ourselves. So how can we, in this moment, in all this uncertainty, find the self-discipline to be more forgiving, to get more resilient, to help quiet someone else's fear, which will help quiet us, to help quiet ours, to be more luminous, to be more expansive, to put ourselves in some place where we are of more service and find the power in that place. So that's about self-discipline. So the second thing I would say is, you're all disciplined on this call, or you wouldn't be on this call in terms of like where you are, right, in relation to Harvard. But more self-discipline, right, in service to making yourself better is extremely valuable. And the last thing I'll say is that purpose. I teach a course at Harvard Business School on authentic leadership, and we spend a great deal of time throughout the course helping people find an animating purpose. Not necessarily a life purpose, because we will have different North Stars to steer by in our lives, many of us. Frederick Douglass only had one, but many of us will have many. But they'll all be important, and they'll take us in a transcendent direction once we stumble into it. So crises are great times to stumble into your purpose, because there's so much good to be done, so many problems to be solved, so many people to help. So let me just encourage you to open up your eyes in the midst of all the other things you're doing and all the stuff coming at you, and think about, is my purpose here somewhere for now? And how do I steer to that? I have seen people grow by leaps and bounds when they find their purpose in extraordinary ways. So let me just encourage you to look for that in the midst of everything else. And last but not least, the world needs you. Leaders come in all shapes and sizes. Greta Thunberg. The coming out of this crisis is going to depend on a whole new group of young leaders in a way it never has before. So when you're ready, get in the game. We need you.
Now, you heard her refer to I, you, I, thou in the course of her closing remarks during that webinar. What she's referring back to is a pamphlet that Martin Buber wrote between 1919 and 1922 that was first published in 1923 in the German title Ich und Du. Now, that is I and you in the informal German case. Now, let's go back to your days in junior high and high school or college when you might have been required to study a foreign language. And you know that a language like French has a informal you, tu, that you use with friends, family, people your own age, and vous, people that are older, people that you've just met, people in business situations. In Italian, it's tu for the informal and lei for the formal. Spanish has so many formal and informal yous, 5 or 6, dependent upon the number of people being spoken to. So even the informal you has multiple forms depending on how many people that you're talking to. What language have I left out? I have not talked about English. English has a formal and an informal you, thou, and you. The informal is the classic poetic language of Shakespeare and the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, thee, thou, thine. What I haven't talked about yet is the first time that Ich und Du appeared in English. So the pamphlet comes out in 1923. The first time it's translated into English is 1937. And the translator chooses to entitle the translation, I and Thou. And so the reason that in English-speaking countries, Buber is often thought of as a theologian, a label he would have soundly rejected, is because of that choice of the thou. think of how it is used today. The only realm where thou survives is the spiritual realm. And so that shaped the way the text was approached. It was translated again in 1970 by Walter Kaufmann, who in his preface to his newer translation says, "The choice of I and thou was unfortunate for English speakers because it brought to the text something that Buber never intended and that non-German speakers wouldn't understand, that du, the informal, is not used as consistently as the French tu, as the Italian tu, as all those Spanish forms. It is highly intimate and is only used between close friends at intimate times or between lovers in their terms of affection." So what you will find is that as this museum thinks about practicing Buber's philosophy, we have chosen I, you, instead of I, thou, because we think it more inclusive, more welcoming. And that is the entire purpose of Buber's work. What does it mean for an organization to be taking a spiritual practice and transforming it into a civil or secular practice for different ends? I think in some ways it harkens back to the very stories that we tell here at the museum when you think about the church covenant that took people from Scrooby, England, into Leiden, Holland, and then from Leiden, Holland, here to Plymouth. So think about those aboard Mayflower and how there were some held together by their spiritual practice. But there were more that were not bound together by a covenant, that were outside. And so to hold everyone together, Mayflower Compact was drafted, and that brought together all 30 households in a civil body politic holding them together. It was a transformation of a religious practice into a civil practice. And that's what we are doing with Buber, taking the spiritual challenge that he gave people, and we are using it for community building, community preservation purposes. His thinking is complex. The language of I, you is very dense. And we have found in the past, as we begin to try to figure out what does Buber mean, how do we put him into pragmatic purpose, sometimes the examples that he gives you can actually be distracting. So what we've done is stripped out all of his examples, and we're taking him down to 4 or 5 basic sentences. So I'm going to share 4 aphorisms with you from Buber, and what I would like you to pay attention to, that it is all about being in relation one with another. It is all about being in dialogue one with another. And by dialogue, I don't mean that it's only speech. Sometimes it's just being present with someone else, being there in the moment, sharing that with them silently. All real living is meeting. Front and center, Buber puts people being together. All real living is meeting. Building on that earlier idea, in the beginning was the relationship. Think about what that means. There are individuals, but the individuals are never in isolation. That meaningful life is always one person with another. And what I would say our museum's intent to do with this is to enfold many people together. And as a good dinner table always has an empty place for the stranger to appear, so that enfolding should always be bringing in that next person, that next person. The world is not comprehensible, but it is embraceable through the embracing of one of its beings. You probably know The Power of One, that classic book about how one life can change so many things. It's embodied in that last aphorism, begin with one. A human being becomes whole not in virtue of relationship to himself or herself only, but rather in virtue of an authentic relation to another human being. So in those 4 simple sentences, we have a challenge: being present with another, realizing that the true intent of our lives is to live in connection. Buber gives us 5 basic relationships to explore, and these are characterized in simple phrases, and I'll walk you through them. Buber says that the lowest form of human relation, if you can even call it human relation, is I-it, in which I look at another person as an it, thinking, what can I get from them? How can I use them to advance my ends? Think what I just said. How can I use them to advance my ends? The important word there being end. This is a temporary relationship in which one person is using and objectifying the other. 2 people still standing apart, though one has used the other. I-you, for Buber, is the ultimate connection in which 2 people are standing face to face. Neither wants anything of the other. Both want to serve the other, and they see one another and are present. They come to that relationship without prejudgment. They are just there. And I-you, unlike I-it, has no end. If that moment is achieved between 2 people, it is, to be hoped, a moment that lasts through the lives of those people and in constant conversation. Will and grace. Buber says that if you have an I-you moment, if you are intent on being present with another person, that will bring grace. And it is a recognition of something has just happened here. We have to think about where the individuals stand. And often we stand in us and them positions in which others who are different than ourselves, as the individual I turns another person into an it, so the group us can turn other groups into them. I-you ultimately is committed to this. It's committed to creating nothing but an us. I-it becomes I-you. Will and grace gives us the power to turn us, them into us, where everyone is included. I had the chance to have a talk with the Reverend Dr. Thomas M. Richard about his experience of Buber. Tom has been in the ministry for 50 years. He's closing his formal ministry this coming Easter Sunday. And when I asked Tom, I said, what was your first experience of Buber? He said, Richard, it was in seminary. So the man that I'm about to introduce you to, it is 5 decades or more of experiencing and thinking and living what Buber wrote about, what he experienced when he was a young man. Tom was ordained in Brookfield, Connecticut in 1963. He served churches in Connecticut, in Maine, in Iowa, before being called by the First Congregational Church of Nantucket in 1986. He served there for 15 years, and in 2001 was chosen the executive director of the National Association of Congregational Christian Churches. That meant he was overseeing 450 churches nationwide, a leadership team of 110 men and women. And Tom's work for the NACCC was marked by running church conflict resolution seminars in more than 22 states in the course of his career. He wanted to come home east to be with family. He served churches in California and then in Marshfield, Massachusetts, before returning home to family on Nantucket. I think you will find him a profound and glorious person. Tom, thank you for being with me to talk about Martin Buber. The museum is committed to realizing his practice in order to serve our guests better and to be more present one with another.
Mm-hmm.
And he describes basic human relationships in simple terms. One of those relations he calls I-it. And what is that all about?
I think it is an objectification of you. If I'm in conversation with you, if I'm treating you or our conversation as an I-it, I've already mentally made the jump into objectifying you. Unfair to you, unfair to what we might actually talk about. Because I have arm's length with you. You're an object. You're to be used rather than get into a meaningful conversation with me. That's an I. And I've made you an I.
And is that the way most people live their lives with others?
Unfortunately, yes.
So how would Buber have us move to that other relationship that he calls I-you? What is I-you all about?
I think it's being open to understanding and learning more about each other. And that is a wonderful conversation starter or relationship starter. I want to know about you. I want to know about your life, not just your work, but if I can move consciously toward it, more about who you really are in your life, what is meaningful to you, those kind of things would get us fairly quickly into an I-you relationship.
To achieve I-you, do both individuals in that relationship have that objective, or can a person you another person
Mm-hmm.
when that person isn't part of the being present with the other?
Well, I think Buber one says that one of the characteristics of I-you is to be present, to really be listening for understanding. So if I am moving in that direction, or I'm open to that direction, I use not only what I say, but you say as a way for us to get closer. And I use indicators from you to make it possible to do that.
He says that if there are I-you moments between people, and you have two people who are willing to do the work of being present with each other, Will and Grace happens, which I love the fact is the name of a sitcom. I love the fact Will and Grace show up if you're willing to do the work.
Yes.
What are the will and the grace that arise from that moment of truly being present with someone else? How does that take us deeper into a kind of community relation?
I think the openness that we have with each other and the feelings that begin to emanate from you and from me about the acceptability of each other, understanding each other. I think that's what gets us going.
I get the sense from reading Buber, and I'm very new to this, that he sees in the very womb, from the very beginnings of our lives, we are yearning to be in relation, in community, and that we are born I, you, and we learn I, it.
Mhm.
Am I getting that
Yes.
correct?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. I
You,
think he's right.
you and I were talking about how to practice I, you is an act of bravery. Could you tell me about that? What
I think our reluctance to get engaged in deep conversations is being limited by our ability to communicate without investing much at all. We have our phones, our iPhones, we have our iPads, we have our computers, we have all kinds of electric means to communicate with each other, not in terribly meaningful ways. I mean, some of them get ridiculous as to how we communicate, in the cryptic way in which we text each other. I'm going shopping. Not terribly meaningful introduction, but it's a reliance too much in our culture, a reliance way too much on the art of listening, understanding, and talking.
Buber seems to be asking us to discover our highest self, and that discovery cannot be made alone or in isolation, that relation is everything. I tried listening to Buber on audiobooks. It was a nightmare. Because you know the book is just a collection of aphorisms, some one sentence long, some a couple of paragraphs, but when you listen to it in one sitting, it's never what he intended. It was meant to stimulate thought. What we're trying to do here at the museum is how do we pare down Martin Buber to basic action steps that we can practice without trying to get deeply into his examples of situations. What are the basic steps of practice?
I write liturgy a lot, and I love it. I love coming up with liturgy that's appropriate for that particular season or week or whatever. I think writing exercises, producing exercises that quickly in short form gets us into asking the right questions of each other. You know, back along we used to have these parlor games of discussion starters, or I'm trying to think of the particular example, but you know what I mean. They'd have questions for you to each of you to share with each other, and that was supposed to get you in conversation. It didn't do very well, as I remember. It was pretty lighthearted stuff. But I think there is a liturgy, ritual or liturgy that can be written that gets you into I, you, communication much quicker, much more effectively. Because you're not sitting there like we are now, trying to think of a response to make. You've already thought of it. You've given a lot of thought to it. And you've put it down so that two people can begin to converse about deeper things. Self-disclosure at that point is more, even though it seems mechanical, I think self-exposure gets away from the mechanics and gets into being with each other, listening to each other, and being present for each other.
And being willing to be vulnerable, that's the ultimate act of bravery in many ways.
It is.
Sharing the true self. And I know for me, and what I would love the museum experience to be here, is one in which we are always present one with another, ourselves and our guests, ourselves and our colleagues. And can we bring that practice outside of ourselves so that not only are we sharing historical content, we're also conveying the experience of the past in ways that are useful when our guests are no longer with us,
Right.
teaching them how to be present in the lives of others.
And having a review process as you're writing this liturgy that I'm suggesting, having an additional meeting of the minds about how do we unwrap this? After a tour is done, how do we meet with our people to talk about the meaning of what they heard or saw? Not just, do you have any questions, but ask the questions that you imagine they might have. Because it would probably engender more questions. They would probably jump into them. I have found it true in being a docent myself at a museum on the island that when I asked questions that I thought they were going to ask me, it always opened up more questions from them, and the conversation deepened.
So in some ways, you purposely walking that journey Buber would put us on is kind of like that old classic that says, let your reach be greater than your grasp, that you're always striving and inquiring. And it's other-centered, which I think is going to be challenging for a lot of people to realize that we are not the center of the world. We are part of a larger community.
One way I just thought of in this review of what their experience just was here, what they experienced, is to say something like, I know there are probably questions. You have questions about what you saw and what you understand, and maybe some questions about what you didn't see or understand. I want to help you understand what was shared. So the I offers to be the you for a moment and go deeper into our relationship as we're talking about their experience here at the museum. Reviewing it with them, not over them, and not directive, but really asking them to ponder and think about their experience here. And I know there are, I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I know there are things you could say that would introduce it, that would invite it.
I wrote this down so that I would get it correctly. Buber says that a man or woman is transformed when he or she is able to say you to the entire world. But that requires action, doesn't it? Could I ask you to talk about what we talked about this morning when we visited that?
As if?
Yeah.
The as if?
Yes.
Yeah. I've learned over the years in my ministry that part of sharing the gospel every week is to suggest to them, after you share it, after you share your interpretation, to suggest to them how they can act as if they are able to live it. Examples, stories, sharing of your experience opens up the possibility that they can, through use of prayer and liturgy, they can get to that place more quickly when they're ready to think about that and its implication for what you would do in relationship to what you heard. One way to do that is to ask them to act as if. Acting as if is, I hear the words, I've read the text, I've listened to the sermon, the message, or the interpretation. There are pieces of it I don't understand. If I were to act this out, what would it look like? What would it sound like? Because if you do that and you take the time to do that, I think the Almighty is in the midst of that kind of communication. And when you have been able to do it once, twice, 3 times, it is a way. I am 50 years in the ministry. I use that way all the time. And it gets me in a place. I try in my own mind to act out what I thought I preached. And sometimes it only takes 10 minutes after worship, and during coffee hour, no less, that I think of how I would best act this out. Then I know if I return to that action, wherever and whenever, I will be able to be present with what we talked about and how we connected. I use what seems artificial way. Liturgy is sometimes an artificial way to get us to a deeper sense of presence. I think acting as if you use it often enough, you don't even have to guess how to do it. You automatically come to that place where you may be alone, or you may be in conference. You and I may be in conversation about it, and I've been open to you, and now we are open to something you say that affects me. I don't just hear it. Something you said as I was acting out what I understood I did or said. You suddenly say something in that conversation that enlightens me. I just can't believe anything other than God is in the midst of that conversation. And it happens by design. Sometimes it happens and I am taken completely out of the mix. It's other than. But most of the time, it's not that way. I've opened myself to it, and suddenly by just doing that, sometimes it's just a prayer that I pray to myself. It gets me in the place where I hear you on a deeper level than I ever would otherwise.
So as if is a type of parallel practice
Yes.
to I, you, or a step along the way.
Yes.
Tom, thank you so much Thank you for sharing time with me.
Thank you for
Thank
inviting
you.
me.
And setting me on my as-if path in
Yeah.
addition to my IU path. Thank you, sir.
And anytime you need to come to terms with what it might mean to act as if, think about method actors. Every time I think about it, I think of somebody in particular and the brilliance with which they play a role. And it's a step on the way to seeing them as a totally different person.
And that's what we want to be.
That's what we want to be.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Bless you.
Thank you. When Tom came to the museum to talk with me about Buber, we had the chance to have lunch with Kim Van Warmer, who is the guest experience manager at the Plymouth Grist Mill. And watching the two of them talk back and forth about their own experiences and thoughts on Buber was fascinating. And I wanted all of you to meet Kim and to hear about the work that she's been doing in helping us develop a Plymouth Patuxet Museum practice inspired by Buber's philosophy. I think few people know that there's a tradition or a practice here at the museum called Manager on Duty, and every Saturday or Sunday, one of us from the management team is here, and we're visiting all the historic sites, providing support when it's needed, driving golf carts if a guest needs to get from point A to point B. And there was one day when I was manager on duty and I came to the Plymouth Grist Mill. You were there, Lisa Perot was there, and you were both so excited about the Buber practice and wanting to talk to me about it more. And I was thrilled that you were practicing. What was it that engaged you? And when were the moments you realized it was happening to you?
Yeah, I think it wasn't, as you know, because you've done it, we've been introduced to the idea of this practice and during our training sessions. And we sort of, I think like a lot of things, it sort of has to percolate a little bit. So I'm sorry to say, it wasn't like, yes, we're gonna go out and we're gonna do this new thing. It sat with us for a little bit, and then we were just having a conversation, and we were talking about all of the real interactions that seemed really impactful. And then it sort of struck us, the common denominator in all of these interactions is that they were these real human, person to person, I and you sort of moments. So that really got us, it sort of took us from the idea of theory to practice. And like a lot of people that work on the sites, I'm sure as we talk about this more, we're going to realize that it's not a brand new thing, that we've been doing it in small little pieces here and there. So it's recognizing those moments when it happens and then learning from those and learning how to do it more and more regularly and more effectively.
You and I were talking about this is a kind of a pivotal opportunity for the museum. We've survived 75 years. We're at the start of the 76th season. And there's a wonderful quotation that Buber says, "To be old can be glorious if one has not unlearned how to begin." What does that strike? How does that strike you? That idea of we might be an older organization, but we still can learn and try something new.
Yeah, I feel we're all very proud of the work that we've done across our 75 years and what we've really, perhaps one of the things that we're most proud about is role playing and our Wampanoag program, and we've done some really kind of really important, really kind of groundbreaking work earlier, and I think we're getting a little gray around the temples. But I think that quote is perfect because we're still learning and the world is changing. I think that there are still lots of ways that we can respond and be of service, And I feel like this program, this idea of I and you and interacting and this connection to people, I really feel like this could be the new thing, not for the sake of a new important thing, but as something that's really responsive and really important to the way that the world is today.
Exactly.
Yeah, with digital communication and with a lot of the conflict that we have in society today. If we can sort of be a model to people about how to respect each other and how to see each other, I think that would be tremendously important. It's certainly not that we're forgetting the stories that we tell, because there is so much to be learned and gleaned from in those stories. So it's not that we're shifting the importance away from the stories that we tell and about what happened and what we can learn from it, but it's sort of adding another layer on top of that by telling the stories in this personal, interactive way. We're sort of we're sort of putting another layer on that. We're kind of double dipping or something. Do you know what I mean by that?
I do,
Yeah.
and there's an amazing story about a family that came at the end of day, and you had a realization about your interaction with them. Can you tell me that story?
Yeah, it was, usually as we feel like as public historians, as educators in the museum environment, we measure success as, I told them so much stuff. They went away learning so much stuff. We measure our success by the amount of information that we can give to them, which is sort of transactional. And sort of pat yourself on the back, like, yeah, I taught them so much stuff. So at the end of the day, it's late, there's a family, they came in at the very end of the day. It was a mother and father and their child, and they sat down and they were just enjoying time together as a family, and they were coloring, and I overheard them talking about, like, well, where are we going to eat? What about this restaurant, or what about that restaurant? And they were also, it was after 5 o'clock, and I was just sort of, letting them sit. And so I sort of heard them say that, so I jumped in and said, oh, well, just talked about some of the places, of course, highlighting the ones that serve our cornmeal. And then, it was maybe 20 minutes after we closed, and as they were leaving, she just looked at me like, so it was so person to person, and she just said, thank you. And to me, it was just sort of a everyday kind of encounter, but it was something very personal. It was very important to her, and it really made me realize that it's not. I didn't even realize, she was having more of that person-to-person moment than I thought I was. That I realized, but just realizing that it's not entirely about the transaction of giving information, but it's also about this personal kind of contact.
Yeah. And you have a story that to me is the ultimate example of that, because you and I have been here how many years? We started out as brother and sister many years ago in the Pilgrim Village. But you tell a story about two couples who you encountered at the mill, and you did what I think is the ultimate work of this museum, is not just that we talking back and forth with the guests, but in a nation that's deeply divided, can we get the guests talking to one another? Because Teddy Roosevelt had said, as soon as we begin to distrust one another, democracy is in danger. Mm-hmm. But you had this beautiful moment with two young couples. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, and I'm not even sure what we did to encourage this to happen. I think maybe just providing a welcoming sort of environment, but it was wonderful. These two young couples come in, and they're as just visually, you would say that they were as different as they could be. One was a Mennonite couple, the woman wearing a long dress and a kerchief, so very covered and very modest. And then there was another sort of hip millennial couple with tattoos and piercings. And as they were going through the museum, they're sort of walking next to each other, and you see them starting to engage with each other. And as they go through, they're talking and they're getting more and more animated. by the time they leave the museum, they're deep in conversation, they're laughing, they sit down at our picnic tables, and they probably spend half an hour just sitting and talking and really learning from each other, and it was wonderful.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And I think that's when you and I talked and you said, this is a moment, a shift. I think that's what we need, is that ability to bring people together in ways that use the story and use the sites that we have, but connect them in ways that abide beyond the time with us. Because wouldn't you love to know if they exchanged information and then there was a sustained friendship?
I'd like to think they went out to lunch together because they did. They walked up the path together, so it's possible.
So there's one more quotation I'd like you to consider, because I think of anyone, Kim, you have been so insightful and experimental with the practice, and you are utterly brave about let it reveal to us what it's going to reveal to us. Let me read you this quotation from Buber, and how do you react to it? All journeys have secret destinations of which the traveler is unaware. How does that capture Buber for you, or what this practice might do for us?
I think we don't know where this is going to take us. This is a journey that we're embarking on, and we hope it takes us to this place where we can be a role model for interacting and understanding and acceptance. But it's not, perhaps it's even not the destination that's the important part. It's this practice, it's the journey along the way. And I think we were talking a little bit earlier about this idea of what does the daily sort of practice means? Like what does it look like, or what happens when you get into this circumstance, this of two people coming together and listening and not being transactional? And it's awesome. It's just so, it's so joyful. And how lucky I think we are to work in a museum, or to work in a place where fascinating people from across the world are literally walking by us, and we have the chance to get to know them. There is such joy in people, in getting to know people and acknowledging people and learning about them.
And I'd say that's a great place for us to stop. If that can be the final memory you and I leave our guests with, that there is joy in that connection. Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And in closing, let me remind you, as we must always remind ourselves why we are doing this work, and it can be captured in one word. We are doing this so that we can connect with people, that we can convey life skills, that when they are no longer with us face to face, they are out in the world connecting with other people. And through the gifts that we have been given by the Lilly Endowment of digital capacity, that the moment any guest spends with us face to face is only part of a lifelong relationship where we are present one with another, listening one with another, and we are honoring one with another. And even in places where we don't agree, we are walking side by side and we keep on talking. Thank you for being with us.